The fluorescent lights of the gas station hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across Sarah's face as she glanced at the clock. 5:47 a.m. Just 13 more minutes until her 8-hour shift ended. 13 minutes until she could drag her exhausted body home to her apartment in South Chicago and collapse in a bed. The overnight shift at the Lakeside Gas and Go was never easy, but tonight had been particularly draining. A steady stream of drunk college kids, truckers with complicated coffee orders, and the usual parade of strange characters that populated the city's streets between midnight and dawn. She was wiping down the counter when the police cruiser pulled up to pump number 3. Sarah watched through the streaky windows as 2 officers stepped out, laughing loudly at some private joke. Something in their body language, a certain looseness, a swagger that went beyond the usual police confidence, made her stomach tighten. She'd seen enough officers during her late shifts to recognize when they were coming off a long night, riding high on adrenaline or something else. The bell chimed as they entered the store. The taller one, a red-faced man with a crew cut, headed straight for the coffee station while his partner approached the counter. His nameplate read, Officer Breslin. "Morning," Sarah said with practiced politeness. "Will that be pump 3? Breslin leaned against the counter. "Well, aren't you observant?" He looked over his shoulder at his partner. "Hey, Miller, we got us a real detective over here." Miller snorted as he stirred creamer into his coffee. "Maybe we should recruit her, solve all them shootings on the South Side." His exaggerated accent was clearly meant to mock the way Sarah spoke. Sarah kept her face neutral. "Will you be paying with card or cash today?" "Ooh, all business," Breslin said, elbowing Miller as he approached. "No small talk for Chicago's finest." "I'm just trying to do my job, sir," Sarah replied, fatigue making it harder to maintain her customer service smile. "Your job," Miller repeated, sipping his coffee and grimacing. "This coffee tastes like shit, by the way." "Sorry to hear that," Sarah said mechanically. "That'll be $47.12 for the gas." The officers exchanged glances. Breslin cleared his throat. "Yeah, about that. We forgot our department card. We'll swing back later to take care of it." Sarah felt a flash of irritation cutting through her exhaustion. "I'm sorry, but I can't authorize that. You'll need to pay now, like everyone else." "Like everyone else?" Miller's voice hardened. "We're not everyone else, sweetheart. We're the police. We protect your kind in this neighborhood." "My kind," Sarah repeated, her hands instinctively tightening into fists beneath the counter. "You know what he means," Breslin said, his smile now completely gone. "People who ought to be grateful we're around. Now, be reasonable. We're on duty. We'll come back." Sarah straightened her shoulders. "I can't let you leave without paying. I lose my job." "Let me see some ID," Miller suddenly demanded, his hand moving to rest on his holster. "What's your full name? You got any warrants we should know about? Maybe we need to check the store for compliance. Could take hours." "I haven't done anything wrong," Sarah said, her heart pounding as anger finally overtook fear. "You can't just threaten me because I won't let you steal gas." "Steal?" Breslin stepped closer, his face inches from hers. "You calling us thieves now? Maybe we need to search behind that counter, see what you might be hiding." Something snapped inside Sarah. After months of swallowing her pride, of enduring microaggressions and outright disrespect, of working overnight shifts to put herself through community college, of being passed over for promotion in favor of less qualified white coworkers, this was the final straw. "You want to search me?" she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with rage. "Go ahead and try, but you'll need to pay for your gas first, or I'm calling your supervisor." "You want to search me?" she said, her voice trembling not with fear but with rage. "Go ahead and try, but you'll need to pay for your gas first, or I'm calling your supervisor." Miller's face darkened as he stepped forward, his hand now fully resting on his weapon. "You think some gas station nobody can threaten an officer of the law? Let me tell you something." Before he could finish, Sarah's body moved before her mind had fully decided what to do. Her hand shot out, grabbing the pump handle that was still sitting in its holster near the register, the one she used for emergency refills of the portable gas containers kept behind the counter. In one fluid motion born of pure instinct rather than planning, she aimed and squeezed the trigger. The stream hit Miller square in the chest with surprising force. The clear liquid instantly soaked through his navy uniform, spreading across the fabric like a dark stain. The acrid smell of gasoline immediately filled the confined space of the store, sharp and overwhelming. What the? Miller stumbled backward, his hand splayed out in shock as gasoline dripped from his clothes onto the linoleum floor. Breslin jumped to the side, narrowly avoiding the spray, his face contorting in disbelief. For 3 eternal seconds, nobody moved. The only sound was the soft patter of gasoline dripping from Miller's uniform and the distant hum of the refrigerator units. The atmosphere in the store had transformed completely. Where the officers had radiated intimidating authority moments before, now they stood frozen in sudden vulnerability. Miller looked down at his soaked uniform, then back at Sarah, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions, rage, disbelief, and unmistakable fear. One spark, one static discharge, one flick of a lighter, and he'd go up in flames. They all knew it. You just assaulted an officer, he finally sputtered, but there was a new uncertainty in his voice. His hand had moved away from his weapon, as if he suddenly remembered how combustible everything had become. Sarah remained behind the counter, the pump still gripped firmly in her hand, nozzle pointed at both men. Her heart hammered in her chest so loudly she was sure they could hear it, but her aim didn't waver. The reality of what she'd done was beginning to settle in. She had just doused a police officer with gasoline. There was no going back from this moment, no way to rewind and choose a different path. Yet alongside the terror of consequences bloomed something else, a fierce satisfaction at having finally stood her ground. "I think you gentlemen should leave now," Sarah said, surprised by the steadiness in her voice. "Without your weapons. You can come back for them once you've paid for your gas." "You can't possibly think you'll get away with this," Breslin said, but he remained rooted to the spot, careful to maintain his distance from the pump's range. "I'm already in it," Sarah replied simply. "The question is how far you want this to go. That uniform is evidence of what happened here. So is the security camera footage." She nodded toward the corner where the store's camera was mounted. "Do you really want everyone to see 2 officers threatening a woman for asking them to pay for gas?" Miller's eyes darted to the camera, then back to Sarah. The calculation was visible on his face. The public relations nightmare, the internal affairs investigation, the humiliation of explaining how he'd ended up doused in gasoline by a 5'4" gas station attendant. "This isn't over," he finally said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "Not by a long shot. Your shift just ended, Miller," Breslin muttered, tugging at his partner's sleeve. "We need to get you cleaned up before that stuff burns your skin. Come on." Sarah watched as they backed toward the door, Miller's uniform leaving a trail of droplets on the floor. The bell chimed again as they exited, and only then did Sarah allow her arm to lower, the pump suddenly heavy in her trembling hand. Through the window, she could see them arguing beside their cruiser, Miller gesticulating wildly, while Breslin seemed to be urging caution. Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had just made powerful enemies. Men with badges, guns, and the weight of the system behind them. Through the window, she could see them arguing beside their cruiser, Miller gesticulating wildly, while Breslin seemed to be urging caution. Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she had just made powerful enemies. Men with badges, guns, and the weight of the system behind them. The first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the sky outside, casting the gas station in that strange half-light where shadows still clung to corners but edges were becoming visible. Sarah watched as Miller paced beside the cruiser, his movements jerky with rage, while Breslin spoke into his radio, occasionally glancing toward the store. The smell of gasoline had permeated everything. Her uniform, her hair, the air itself, a persistent reminder of the line she'd crossed. Miller suddenly turned and started marching back toward the entrance, his face contorted with determination. Sarah tightened her grip on the pump handle again, her knuckles white. When the bell chimed for a 3rd time, she was ready, the nozzle aimed directly at him. "Don't," she said simply as he crossed the threshold. Miller stopped, his body rigid with fury, but he didn't advance further. Up close, Sarah could see the gasoline had soaked him thoroughly. His badge glistened with it, and his uniform clung to his chest. Tiny droplets still occasionally fell from his sleeves to the floor. The smell was overpowering in the confined space. "You've made a mistake you can't undo," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Do you have any idea what happens to people who assault officers? You'll lose your job, your apartment. You'll have a record that follows you forever." Despite the threats, Sarah noticed he kept his distance. His hands remained visible at his sides, carefully away from his weapon. For all his bluster, he was deeply aware of his vulnerability. One spark, one static discharge, and he would become a human torch. This knowledge seemed to infuriate him even more than the actual dousing. Behind him, Breslin appeared in the doorway, but didn't enter. "Miller, this isn't smart," he warned, his eyes darting between his partner and Sarah. "We need to report back and get you cleaned up. Think about this." "I'm not leaving without those security tapes," Miller insisted without looking back at his partner. Sarah kept the nozzle steady, her eyes locked on Miller's. Something had fundamentally shifted in her during these past minutes. A lifetime of swallowing indignities, of keeping her head down, had crystallized into this moment of absolute refusal to back down. "The footage uploads automatically to the cloud," she lied, her voice steadier than she felt. "It's already beyond your reach." Breslin stepped forward now, his hands slightly raised in a placating gesture. "Look, we all made some poor choices here. Let's take a step back. Nobody needs to get hurt." The morning light was growing stronger now, streaming through the windows and illuminating the scene in unforgiving clarity. A gas-soaked officer, his nervous partner, and Sarah, exhausted but utterly resolute, holding a potential fire starter in her hand. The ordinary morning sounds of traffic beginning outside created a surreal backdrop to their frozen standoff. "You think you're standing up for something," Miller said, his voice dropping to a whisper as he stared at Sarah. "But you have no idea what you've stepped into. No idea at all." There was something in his eyes that sent a chill through Sarah despite her outward compose, a promise of retribution that went beyond the immediate situation. She realized with sudden clarity that this man wouldn't just file charges against her. He would make destroying her life his personal mission. "I know exactly what I've stepped into," Sarah replied quietly. "I've been standing in it my whole life." A car pulled into the lot outside, headlights sweeping across the windows, the arrival of the morning shift manager. Breslin noticed it too and grabbed Miller's arm. "We need to go. Now." For one breathtaking moment, Sarah thought Miller might lunge for her despite everything. But then something in him seemed to recalculate. With a final look of pure hatred, he allowed Breslin to pull him toward the door. "This isn't over," he said again, the words hanging in the air as they retreated to their cruiser. Sarah watched them pull away, the pump still clutched in her hand, wondering if she had just signed her own destruction warrant or finally discovered her own worth. Sarah watched them pull away, the pump still clutched in her hand, wondering if she had just signed her own destruction warrant or finally discovered her own worth. Mark, the morning manager, walked in seconds later, his coffee thermos freezing halfway to his lips as he took in the scene, Sarah standing rigidly behind the counter, gas pump in hand, and the strong smell of fuel permeating the store. "What the hell happened here?" he asked, eyes wide as he noticed the trail of gasoline droplets leading to the door. Sarah carefully placed the pump back in its holder, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. "Those officers tried to leave without paying. When I insisted, they threatened me." Mark set his thermos down carefully. "And the gasoline?" "I made a choice," Sarah said simply. Outside, the police cruiser hadn't actually left. It had merely circled around to the side of the building, out of immediate view, but still present. Sarah spotted it through the side window and felt her momentary relief evaporate. Through the glass, she watched as Miller reached for his shoulder radio, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Even from this distance, she could read the vindictive satisfaction on his face as he stared directly at the store while speaking into the device. He wanted her to see this, to understand what was coming. "He's calling for backup," Sarah said, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. Mark moved to the window, squinting outside. "Are you sure?" As if in answer, they heard the faint wail of sirens in the distance, growing steadily louder. Miller's lips curled into a smile as he continued speaking into his radio, eyes locked on the store windows. Sarah could almost hear his words: assault on an officer, resisting arrest, threatening police with a dangerous weapon. The charges would pile up, one on top of another, burying her beneath their weight. "I need to make a call," Sarah said suddenly, pulling her cell phone from her pocket. Her fingers trembled as she scrolled to a contact rarely used but never deleted. "Dad, it's me." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "I'm at the station, and I need you to come right now. There's a situation with the police." She paused, listening. "No, I'm fine, but they're trying to say I assaulted them. They came in and refused to pay, then threatened me when I wouldn't let them leave." Another pause. Yes, the cameras were on. Sarah watched through the window as Miller's expression shifted subtly. He had clearly assumed she was calling a boyfriend or a friend, but something in her demeanor must have signaled this was different. She deliberately turned toward the window, making sure he could see her clearly as she spoke her next words. "Dad, they don't know you own this place. They don't know about the additional cameras you installed last month after the robbery, the ones that record audio too." There was no way Miller could hear her words through the glass, but he was a cop. He could read body language, sense when a situation was changing. Sarah saw him straighten slightly, his hand dropping from the radio as his eyes narrowed in reassessment. 20 minutes? Okay. The police are calling backup, so hurry. She ended the call and turned to Mark. "My father's coming. He wants us to pull the security footage right now and send it to his lawyer." Mark's eyebrows shot up. "Your father has a lawyer on standby at 6 in the morning?" "My father has a lawyer on standby at all times," Sarah replied, watching as Miller conferred urgently with Breslin. "He doesn't trust the police. Never has." The sirens were getting closer now, their wailing cutting through the quiet morning. Outside, Miller and Breslin seemed to be having a heated discussion, with Breslin repeatedly shaking his head and gesturing toward their cruiser. Whatever Miller wanted to do, his partner was pushing back hard. Sarah knew the next 20 minutes would determine much of her future. Either her father would arrive in time to prevent her arrest, or she'd be taken away in handcuffs, facing charges serious enough to derail her entire life. What had started as a simple refusal to be disrespected had escalated into something that could follow her forever. As the first additional police car pulled into the lot, lights flashing, she steeled herself for what was coming. The moment when she'd sprayed Miller with gasoline had felt like power, like justice, like finally standing up for herself. Now, in the cold light of morning, with consequences bearing down on her like an oncoming train, she wondered if it had been worth it. But even as doubt crept in, Sarah straightened her shoulders. Yes, it had been worth it. Even if they arrested her today, even if the charges stuck, she would know that for once, she hadn't allowed herself to be bullied, belittled, or brushed aside. For those few moments, she had been the one in control, not them. And no matter what happened next, they would remember the gas station attendant who had dared to stand her ground. As the first additional police car pulled into the lot, lights flashing, she steeled herself for what was coming. The moment when she'd sprayed Miller with gasoline had felt like power, like justice, like finally standing up for herself. Now, in the cold light of morning, with consequences bearing down on her like an oncoming train, she wondered if it had been worth it. But even as doubt crept in, Sarah straightened her shoulders. Yes, it had been worth it. Even if they arrested her today, even if the charges stuck, she would know that for once, she hadn't allowed herself to be bullied, belittled, or brushed aside. For those few moments, she had been the one in control, not them. And no matter what happened next, they would remember the gas station attendant who had dared to stand her ground. The newly arrived officers, a young woman and an older man, approached Miller and Breslin cautiously, their expressions a mix of confusion and concern as they took in Miller's gasoline-soaked uniform. Miller gestured angrily toward the store, his stance aggressive despite his compromised state. The female officer's hand instinctively moved toward her holster, and Sarah felt her heart rate accelerate. Just as the four officers began moving toward the entrance, a black Range Rover pulled into the lot, its tires crunching over the gravel with deliberate slowness. It came to a stop directly between the police vehicles and the store entrance, effectively blocking their approach. Sarah felt her knees go weak with relief. Thomas Wilson stepped out of the vehicle with the unhurried confidence of a man who was never late, but simply arrived precisely when he intended to. At 53, he carried himself with the self-assured bearing that came from building a chain of gas stations and convenience stores from nothing. His charcoal suit was impeccably tailored, his silver-streaked hair neatly combed, a stark contrast to the chaotic scene unfolding around him. P.S. surveyed the situation with a calm, assessing gaze. For police officers, one conspicuously soaked in gasoline, his daughter and the morning manager watching anxiously through the store windows, and the unmistakable tension hanging in the air. He didn't rush, didn't raise his voice, didn't immediately choose a side. He simply walked toward the store entrance, forcing the officers to adjust their position to accommodate him. "Mr. Wilson," Breslin said, recognition dawning on his face. "This is your station?" Thomas paused, one hand on the door. "All 17 of them in the Chicago area," he replied evenly. "This one especially, since my daughter works here." Miller stepped forward, gasoline still dripping occasionally from his cuffs. "Your daughter assaulted a police officer," he said, voice tight with controlled rage. "She's facing serious charges." Thomas turned fully toward Miller now, his expression unchanged but something hardening in his eyes. "Is that so?" His gaze traveled deliberately from Miller's face down to his soaked uniform, then back up. "And may I ask what preceded this alleged assault?" "That's not relevant to," Miller began, but Thomas cut him off with a raised hand. "Everything that happens on my property is relevant to me, officer." The title sounded like something else entirely in Thomas's mouth. "Now, before anyone does anything hasty, I suggest we all step inside and review the security footage. My stations have excellent coverage, multiple angles, audio recording, cloud backup. Very thorough." The female officer glanced at her older colleague, uncertainty evident in her expression. The senior officer stepped forward. "Sir, we're responding to a call about an assault on officers. And I'm responding to a call from my daughter about officers threatening her and refusing to pay for services," Thomas replied coolly. "Fortunately, we don't have to rely on competing narratives when we have the actual events recorded." He pushed open the door and held it, an invitation that felt more like a challenge. Sarah watched as her father entered, his presence immediately filling the small store. He looked at her, a world of questions in his eyes, but all he said was, "Are you hurt?" Sarah shook her head. Thomas turned back to face the officers, who had followed him inside with visible reluctance. His gaze swept over the gasoline puddles on the floor. The pump Sarah had returned to its holder, and finally, deliberately, to the security cameras mounted in each corner of the store. "Now," he said, his voice deceptively conversational, "can someone explain why my daughter felt the need to defend herself with a gas pump against two armed officers of the law?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Sarah watched as Miller's face darkened with fury while Breslin looked increasingly uncomfortable. The two newly arrived officers exchanged glances, clearly sensing they had walked into something more complicated than a simple assault case. In that moment, standing beside her father, Sarah realized the power dynamics had shifted yet again. What had begun as two officers thinking they could intimidate a lone gas station attendant had transformed into something much more unpredictable. A confrontation where the balance of power wasn't determined solely by badges and guns, but by cameras, witnesses, and a father who had the resources to fight back. In that moment, standing beside her father, Sarah realized the power dynamics had shifted yet again. What had begun as two officers thinking they could intimidate a lone gas station attendant had transformed into something much more unpredictable. A confrontation where the balance of power wasn't determined solely by badges and guns, but by cameras, witnesses, and a father who had the resources to fight back. Well, Thomas prompted when no one immediately answered his question. I'm particularly interested in why officer, he squinted at the soaked name badge. Miller here appears to have taken a gasoline shower on my property. Miller's jaw worked as if chewing on words too dangerous to release. Your daughter assaulted me with a dangerous substance. That's a felony. Interesting, Thomas replied. He turned to Mark. Would you be kind enough to pull up the security footage from the last 30 minutes? Let's display it on the monitor behind the counter. Mark nodded and moved to the small office at the back of the store. Miller took a half step forward, his hand twitching toward his belt. I would strongly advise against interfering with evidence, Thomas said, his voice hardening, especially since my security system automatically uploads to servers my legal team can access. 2 more police cruisers pulled into the lot, their lights creating a disorienting blue and red strobe effect through the store windows. 4 additional officers entered, their expressions shifting from professional readiness to confusion as they took in the bizarre tableau. A gas-soaked Miller, the unmistakable smell of fuel permeating the air, and Thomas Wilson, whom several of them clearly recognized, standing protectively near his daughter. Captain Davis, Thomas said, nodding to the highest-ranking officer who had just arrived. I believe we met at the Chamber of Commerce fundraiser last month. Captain Davis, a woman in her late 40s with close-cropped gray hair, assessed the scene with practiced neutrality. Mr. Wilson, I didn't realize this was your establishment. One of many, Thomas replied. We were just about to review some security footage that I think will clarify the situation. Mark returned to the front, giving a thumbs up to indicate the video was ready. The small monitor behind the counter flickered to life, displaying a crystal-clear view of the store interior from earlier that morning. Everyone turned to watch as the scene unfolded in silent video. The officers entering, their mocking comments to Sarah, the escalating tension, the refusal to pay, the threats, and finally, Sarah's desperate response with the gas pump. When the footage ended, the store was silent except for the soft hum of the refrigeration units. Captain Davis turned to Miller and Breslin, her expression unreadable. Where's the audio? Miller demanded, breaking the silence. Convenient that we can't hear what was actually said. The audio system is separate, Thomas explained smoothly. For privacy reasons, we store audio files on a different server. But I can certainly have my legal team provide those files during discovery, should this matter proceed to court. He paused meaningfully. Along with the body cam footage from your uniforms, of course. Miller and Breslin exchanged glances. Everyone in the room knew that if they had followed procedure, their body cameras would have been activated, and if they hadn't been, that would raise even more questions. Captain Davis cleared her throat. Officers Miller and Breslin, I'd like to speak with you outside. Her tone left no room for argument. As they filed out, Miller paused at the door, turning to glare at Sarah. This isn't justice, he hissed. This is connections and money talking. No, Thomas replied before Sarah could speak. This is accountability, something you might want to familiarize yourself with. The door closed behind them, and through the windows, Sarah watched as Captain Davis engaged in what appeared to be a very one-sided conversation with the 2 officers. Miller's body language was all defensive anger, his gestures becoming increasingly agitated while Breslin stared at the ground. After several minutes, Davis pointed firmly at their cruiser. Both officers reluctantly got in, Miller's uniform still visibly damp and undoubtedly reeking of gasoline. The vehicle pulled away, followed by 2 of the backup cruisers, leaving only Captain Davis and 1 other officer behind. Davis re-entered the store, her expression grave but professional. Mr. Wilson, Ms. Wilson, we'll need statements from both of you. I'll also be filing an internal affairs report regarding this incident. Thomas nodded. We're happy to cooperate, and I appreciate your handling of the situation. The subtext was clear. He noticed and approved of her sending Miller away rather than escalating the confrontation. As they began the process of giving statements, Sarah caught her father's eye. There was concern there, but also something else, a certain pride that made her stand a little straighter. She had stood her ground when it would have been easier to back down, and while she knew there would likely be consequences still to come, in this moment, Watching Miller's cruiser disappear down the street, she felt something she hadn't experienced in a very long time. Vindication. The gas station smelled strongly of fuel. The floor was stained with puddles that would need special cleaning, and her hand still trembled slightly with residual adrenaline. But for once, the system that so often protected its own had been forced to acknowledge its failure. It wasn't justice, not completely, but it was a start. The gas station smelled strongly of fuel. The floor was stained with puddles that would need special cleaning, and her hand still trembled slightly with residual adrenaline. But for once, the system that so often protected its own had been forced to acknowledge its failure. It wasn't justice, not completely, but it was a start. By mid-afternoon, Sarah had given her statement, helped Mark clean up the gasoline spills, and finally ended her double shift. As she walked to her car, her father fell in his step beside her. "You could have called me sooner," he said quietly. "I know," Sarah admitted. I've been trying to handle things on my own." Thomas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "I'm proud of you for standing up for yourself. Though perhaps next time, consider a method that doesn't involve flammable liquids." "Despite everything," Sarah laughed. "I'll keep that in mind." Meanwhile, across town at the Chicago Police Department's Northwest District Station, Sergeant Miller had endured the most humiliating day of his 15-year career. The story had spread through the precinct within hours. The hard-ass Miller, known for his no-nonsense approach and intimidating presence, had been doused in gasoline by a gas station attendant half his size. "Hey, Miller," called Officer Jenkins as Miller emerged from the locker room in fresh clothes, his hair still damp from the shower that hadn't fully removed the gasoline smell from his skin. "Fill her up." Laughter erupted from the nearby desks. Miller kept walking, his face burning with rage and embarrassment. In the break room, conversation halted abruptly when he entered, then resumed at a lower volume punctuated by poorly concealed snickering. He poured coffee with a hand that wasn't quite steady, hyper-aware of the eyes watching him. "I heard she nailed you right in the chest," said Ramirez, leaning against the counter with a smirk. "Got good aim, huh?" "You shouldn't believe everything you hear," Miller growled, but the damage was already done. The truth was on the security footage, which he had no doubt would eventually make its way around the department despite Captain Davis's assurances of discretion. When he returned to his desk, someone had left a small toy gas pump on his keyboard. He swept it into the trash with a violent motion, his jaw clenched so tight it ached. Breslin wasn't faring much better. As the junior partner, he was bearing the brunt of jokes about failing to control the situation, and his partner, "I hear you two are being reassigned to the fire department," called someone from across the bullpen. "Since you're already pre-soaked." More laughter. Miller saw Breslin's shoulders hunch as he tried to make himself smaller behind his computer screen. By the end of the day, Miller had been summoned to Captain Davis's office and formally placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation. He sat rigidly in the chair across from her desk as she explained the process in clinical terms that barely registered through the roaring in his ears. "Your conduct was unbecoming of an officer," Davis concluded, her expression stern. "The footage clearly shows harassment and attempted intimidation of a civilian. You're lucky Mr. Wilson isn't pursuing criminal charges." "She assaulted me," Miller insisted through clenched teeth. Davis leaned forward. "After you threatened her. Don't make this worse than it already is, Miller. Take the leave, cooperate with IA, and pray this blows over." But Miller knew it wouldn't blow over. Not the jokes, not the humiliation, not the stain on his record. As he walked to his car that evening, catching whispers and smirks from colleagues along the way, something hardened inside him. This wasn't just about a gas station incident anymore. This was about respect, about standing his ground, about showing everyone, especially Sarah Wilson and her connected father, that he wasn't someone to be laughed at. In the privacy of his car, Miller pulled out his phone and opened Google, typing Wilson Gas Station Chicago into the search bar. If Thomas Wilson thought this was over, he was sorely mistaken. No one humiliated James Miller and walked away unscathed. No one. Across town, Sarah finally arrived home at her small apartment, exhaustion settling into her bones as she locked the door behind her. Despite everything, she felt an unexpected peace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, possible legal repercussions, media attention if the story leaked, the knowledge that she'd made an enemy of a police officer. But for tonight, she allowed herself to feel the quiet satisfaction of having finally stood her ground. As she drifted toward sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the image of Miller's face when the gasoline had hit him. That moment of utter shock when he realized she wasn't going to be another person who simply absorbed his bullying. Whatever came next, she would face it knowing she had found strength she hadn't known she possessed. What Sarah couldn't know was that across the city, Miller sat in his darkened living room, scrolling through public records and social media profiles, piecing together the details of her life with methodical precision. His humiliation had crystallized into something dangerous, an obsessive determination to restore his image, his pride, his sense of control. The confrontation at the gas station was over, but the real battle was just beginning. 3 days after the incident, Sarah returned to work. Her father had offered her paid time off, but staying home alone with her thoughts wasn't appealing. The routine of the job provided structure, even comfort. The store had been thoroughly cleaned, no trace of gasoline remaining except in her memory. Customers came and went as usual, though a few regular patrons mentioned seeing something about the incident on local news. Sarah kept her responses vague and professional. The security footage hadn't been leaked yet, but enough people had witnessed the aftermath that the story had spread through the neighborhood. Some customers seemed to look at her with new respect, others with wariness. What Sarah didn't know was that across the street, parked in a faded blue sedan, Sergeant James Miller watched the gas station through narrowed eyes. He had been sitting there for 2 hours, a coffee gone cold in the cup holder beside him. Officer Breslin shifted uncomfortably in the passenger seat. "This isn't a good idea, Jim," Breslin said, not for the first time. "Internal affairs is already breathing down our necks." Miller didn't respond, his eyes fixed on the store entrance. Every time the door opened, his body tensed, then relaxed when it wasn't Sarah who emerged. "We're off duty," Breslin continued when Miller remained silent. "If anyone reports us sitting here." "Nobody's reporting anything," Miller finally snapped. "We're just 2 guys having coffee in a car." Breslin glanced at his partner's untouched coffee, then at the notebook in Miller's lap where he'd been jotting down the times of Sarah's breaks, interactions, and movements that were visible through the store windows. "This is crossing a line," Breslin said quietly. "Let go, man. It was embarrassing, but it'll blow over." Miller turned to him, his expression chilling. "Blow over? The other day, my kid came home from school asking why his friends were saying his dad got a gasoline bath from a girl." His fingers tightened around the pen. "My own son, hearing about how his father got humiliated." Breslin looked away, uncomfortable with the intensity in Miller's eyes. This wasn't just about professional pride anymore. It had become dangerously personal. "All I'm saying is, sitting here watching her isn't helping anything," Breslin tried again. Miller's mouth tightened. "I need to understand her patterns. Her vulnerabilities." "Her vulnerabilities?" Breslin echoed, alarm evident in his voice. "What exactly are you planning?" Before Miller could answer, the gas station door opened, and Sarah emerged. Both men fell silent, watching as she spoke briefly to another employee, then walked to her car. Miller started the engine. "Let's see where she goes." "No." Breslin's hand shot out, grasping Miller's arm. "This is stalking, Jim. It's illegal, and you know it. I didn't say anything the first time we drove by, or the second, but this is the 3rd day in a row we've sat here watching her." Miller shrugged off Breslin's hand, his eyes tracking Sarah's car as it pulled out of the lot. "Either come with me or get out." Breslin hesitated, caught between loyalty to his partner and the knowledge that what they were doing crossed serious ethical and legal boundaries. Finally, he reached for the door handle. "I can't be part of this. And as your friend, I'm telling you to stop before you do something that ends more than just your career." Miller barely seemed to notice as Breslin exited the car. He waited until Sarah's vehicle turned onto the main road, then pulled out to follow at a careful distance. Each day that followed saw Miller's obsession deepen. He created a detailed log of Sarah's movements, her work schedule, regular coffee stops, grocery trips, even her occasional visits to her father's home in Lake Forest. When she wasn't working at the station, he would drive past her apartment building in Rogers Park, sometimes parking across the street for hours. What Miller didn't know was that after a week of these drive-bys, Thomas Wilson had decided to transfer Sarah to administrative duties at the company headquarters. The official reason was a promotion, but both father and daughter knew it was primarily about safety. Sarah hadn't spotted Miller directly, but she'd felt watched, developing the prickling awareness of eyes following her movements. When Miller arrived at the gas station on the 8th day of his surveillance and couldn't spot Sarah inside, he approached the counter, badge concealed, pretending to be a regular customer. "The girl who usually works mornings," he said casually to the cashier, a college-aged boy who looked bored. "Sarah, is she off today?" The boy shrugged. "She doesn't work here anymore. Got moved to corporate or something." Miller's face remained impassive, but his hand tightened around his wallet until the leather creaked. "Corporate, huh? Good for her." Back in his car, Miller slammed his palm against the steering wheel. Sarah Wilson had slipped away from his daily observation, hidden behind the security of corporate offices and her father's protection. But rather than discouraging him, this development only intensified his determination. He opened his notebook, flipping to the page where he'd not. At her home address. If she wouldn't be at the gas station, he would have to adjust his strategy. After all, everyone had to go home eventually. Later that night, Miller sat in his darkened living room, his laptop casting a blue glow over his unshaven face as he scrolled through public records databases using his police credentials. On the coffee table lay printed photos of Sarah, screenshots from security footage, zoomed-in images captured on his phone during his surveillance, even a company photo he'd found on the Wilson gas station's website. What had begun as a desire for retribution had evolved into something more disturbing. A fixation that consumed his thoughts during every waking hour and followed him into restless dreams where he repeatedly confronted her, each scenario ending with him regaining the power and respect he felt she had stolen. As he stared at her image on the screen, Miller whispered a promise to himself. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. As he stared at her image on the screen, Miller whispered a promise to himself. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. The following morning, Thomas Wilson stood at his office window, gazing out at the Chicago skyline without really seeing it. The phone call he'd just received from his security team weighed heavily on his mind. For the third consecutive night, security cameras had captured the same unmarked sedan circling the gas station where Sarah had previously worked. The license plate matched an unmarked police vehicle assigned to the Northwest District. Thomas turned away from the window as his office door opened and Sarah entered, carrying 2 coffee cups. She handed one to him before settling into the chair across from his desk. "You look worried," she observed, studying his face. Thomas took a sip of coffee, debating how much to share. The security team called. "That officer, Miller, has been circling your old workplace. 3 nights in a row now." Sarah's expression tightened, but she didn't seem surprised. "I felt like someone was watching me last week. I kept seeing the same car in my rearview mirror. Why didn't you tell me?" Thomas demanded, his calm facade slipping. "Because I knew you'd react exactly like this," Sarah replied, gesturing at his tense posture. "Dad, I can handle myself. I proved that at the gas station." "This is different," Thomas said, setting down his cup and leaning forward. "Men like Miller, they don't let go easily. A public humiliation like that, especially for someone in his position, it festers." Sarah met his gaze steadily. "So what do you want me to do? Hide? Move? Change my name? Let him win." Thomas recognized the stubborn set of her jaw, the same expression she'd worn since childhood when facing down bullies or challenges. It was a quality he'd always admired in her, even when it worried him. "I want you to be safe," he said simply. "I am safe. I'm working here now, in a secure building. I'm being careful. What else can I do?" Thomas picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts. "For starters, you can stay at my house for a while. And I'm calling Kevin Walsh." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Your lawyer?" "Dad, we've been through this. I don't want to file charges or make this any bigger than it already is." "Not my lawyer," Thomas corrected. "My friend Kevin, the one who's on the police board." Understanding dawned on Sarah's face. You're going to use your connections to get him fired. I'm going to use my connections to ensure a potentially dangerous officer doesn't remain in a position to abuse his power, Thomas countered. This isn't just about you anymore, Sarah. A man who stalks someone over a personal grievance shouldn't be carrying a badge and gun. Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. If you do this, he'll know it was you. It might make things worse, or it might end things before they escalate further. Thomas began dialing. Either way, I'm not waiting to find out. As his friend Kevin answered, Thomas watched his daughter's face. He recognized her conflict, the desire to handle things herself, battling with the practical recognition that this situation had moved beyond her control. It was the same expression she'd worn as a teenager when she'd finally admitted she needed his help with the mean girls at her private school who'd been bullying her. Back then, a phone call to the principal and a substantial donation to the school's new science wing had resolved the issue. But Thomas knew this situation wouldn't be solved so easily. Men like Miller didn't back down without a significant push, and Thomas was prepared to push as hard as necessary to protect his daughter. Kevin, he said into the phone, his voice shifting into the confident tone he used for business negotiations. I need a favor regarding a Chicago PD officer. It's about a situation that's becoming increasingly concerning. He paused, listening. Yes, it involves my daughter. And yes, I have documentation. As Thomas detailed the situation to his friend, Sarah stared out the window at the city below. She felt a complicated mix of emotions, gratitude for her father's protection, frustration at needing it, and beneath it all, a nagging fear that this wouldn't be resolved as neatly as her father hoped. Miller didn't strike her as a man who would simply accept defeat, badge or no badge. When Thomas ended the call, he looked both satisfied and troubled. Kevin will bring it up at tomorrow's meeting. With the security footage and Breslin potentially willing to testify about Miller's behavior, there should be enough to justify termination, or, at minimum, a transfer far away from Chicago. Sarah nodded, though uncertainty still clouded her expression. And if that doesn't work? Thomas's face hardened in a way Sarah rarely saw, the expression he wore when facing down business rivals or threats to his family. Then we explore other options. No one threatens my daughter. No one. As Sarah left his office, Thomas returned to the window, looking out at the city he'd conquered through decades of hard work and strategic relationships. He'd built an empire from nothing, protecting it with the same determination he now focused on his daughter's safety. In his world, problems had solutions, sometimes expensive ones, sometimes morally ambiguous ones, but solutions nonetheless. What troubled him most wasn't Miller's current behavior, disturbing as it was. It was the recognition of something in the officer's eyes that Thomas had seen before in men pushed to their breaking point, a dangerous irrationality that couldn't be reasoned with or bought off. Thomas picked up his phone again, scrolling to another contact, one he hadn't needed to call in many years. Some situations required more than just legal or professional intervention. Some required preparation for worst-case scenarios. As the call connected, Thomas spoke quietly into the phone. Stuart, it's Wilson. I may need your services again. As the call connected, Thomas spoke quietly into the phone. Stuart, it's Wilson. I may need your services again. By 8 that evening, Thomas had settled into a corner booth at the Derby, an old-school steakhouse in downtown Chicago where the wood-paneled private rooms had hosted decades of conversations that never made the public record. The maitre d' had nodded in silent recognition, leading him through the main dining area to a secluded room in the back, where Stuart Blanchard waited. Stuart hadn't changed much in the 5 years since Thomas had last required his particular talents. Still the same immaculate gray suit, the same military-precise haircut, the same calm eyes that revealed nothing. As a former internal affairs investigator who'd retired under murky circumstances, Stuart maintained connections throughout the Chicago Police Department that proved valuable to businessmen like Thomas. It's been a while, Stuart said, pouring Thomas a glass of scotch from the bottle already on the table. I assumed you'd gone legitimate. Thomas allowed himself a small smile. I've always been legitimate. I just occasionally need help navigating complicated situations. And this situation involves a Sergeant James Miller Stewart stated, placing a thin file on the table. I did some preliminary research after your call. Thomas opened the file, scanning the contents. Miller's service record, performance reviews, civilian complaints. 17 complaints in 12 years. All dismissed or ruled unfounded, he noted. Standard for officers who know how to work the system, Stewart replied. What's interesting is the pattern, escalating aggression, particularly toward women who challenge his authority. Thomas's jaw tightened as he continued reading. And the department does nothing. They move him around, partner him with steadier officers, give him the occasional slap on the wrist. Stewart took a sip of his drink. Until there's a major incident or political pressure, guys like Miller keep their badges. Then we'll create the pressure. The door opened, and 3 men entered, 2 in plain clothes who carried themselves unmistakably like police officers, and 1 uniformed Captain Thomas recognized as Victor Ramirez from the Internal Affairs Division. Mr. Wilson, Ramirez said, taking a seat. Stewart explained your situation. I want to be clear. I'm here unofficially. Thomas nodded. I understand discretion, Captain, and I appreciate it. The other 2 men introduced themselves simply as Daniels and Mercer, offering no ranks or divisions. Thomas didn't press for details. In his experience, the less he knew about certain aspects of these arrangements, the better. Miller is becoming a liability to the department, Ramirez said, declining the offered scotch. This isn't the first time he's developed fixations. But his closure rates are high, and he has friends in the union. I don't care about department politics, Thomas said, his voice hardening. I care about my daughter's safety. Miller has been stalking her, using police resources to track her movements. That ends now. Daniels leaned forward. Direct intervention could backfire. If Miller feels targeted, especially by you, it might push him further. So what do you suggest? Thomas asked, though he already had his own ideas. Mercer spoke for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft for his imposing frame. Miller's on thin ice with IA already. One more incident, the right kind of incident, will be enough to justify termination, maybe even criminal charges. And what exactly would the right kind of incident be? Thomas asked. One that exposes his obsession while ensuring your daughter remains completely safe, Stewart interjected. We create a situation where Miller reveals himself, where his own actions become the evidence that condemns him. Ramirez nodded. We have a female officer who resembles your daughter. With the right timing and location, we could set up a scenario where Miller believes he's following Sarah, but he's actually following our officer. And when he makes his move? Thomas asked. We'll be waiting, Daniels said simply. Body cameras back up nearby, everything by the book, officially at least. Thomas considered the plan, turning his glass slowly between his fingers. And my daughter's role in this? Minimal, Stewart assured him. She maintains her normal schedule at your corporate offices, which are secure. Our decoy handles the rest. Thomas reached into his jacket and removed an envelope, sliding it across the table. Consider this a consultation fee. There will be more when the situation is resolved, permanently. No one counted the money. That wasn't how these arrangements worked. Ramirez didn't touch the envelope, maintaining the fiction that he wasn't part of the financial transaction, though Thomas knew a share would find its way to him eventually. 1 week, Mercer said, standing. We'll need that long to set everything up properly. Thomas shook his head. Miller's escalating now. I want this handled in 3 days. The men exchanged glances, a silent negotiation taking place. 3 days, Ramirez finally agreed. But your daughter needs to stay at your Lake Forest house during that time. Complete separation from her normal routines. Agreed, Thomas said, though he knew convincing Sarah would be challenging. As the meeting concluded and hands were shaken, Thomas felt the familiar weight of crossing certain lines. Lines he'd promised himself he'd stop crossing when he became legitimate. But some situations left no choice, especially when family was threatened. Stewart remained behind after the others left, sipping his scotch thoughtfully. You realize this won't be clean, he said. Men like Miller don't go quietly. I don't need clean, Thomas replied, his voice dropping to a cold timbre that rarely emerged in his public life. I need effective. If Miller loses his badge, his pension, his freedom, all the better. But what I need is for him to understand with absolute certainty that my daughter is untouchable. Stewart studied his old client, recognizing the steel beneath the expensive suit. And if understanding isn't enough, Thomas met his gaze without flinching. Then we moved to more permanent solutions. Thomas met his gaze without flinching. Then we moved to more permanent solutions. The following morning, Miller and Breslin sat in their unmarked car outside Wilson Gas Station's corporate headquarters, a gleaming 20-story building in downtown Chicago. Miller had been reinstated to limited duty after his administrative leave, though the internal investigation remained open. He'd convinced Breslin to come along by framing it as a chance to clear the air with Sarah Wilson. "This is a bad idea," Breslin said, eyeing the security cameras positioned at the building's entrance. "We're supposed to be on patrol in Wicker Park." Miller ignored him, watching employees enter the building. "We need 10 minutes with her. That's all." "For what?" Breslin demanded. "To intimidate her? To make things worse? To reach an understanding," Miller insisted, though his clenched jaw suggested different intentions. After 30 minutes with no sign of Sarah, Miller's patience evaporated. He put the car in drive and headed toward their next lead, the gas station where it had all started. Mark Davis was restocking cigarettes behind the counter when the bell chimed. He looked up to see the two officers entering, immediately recognizing the taller one as the man Sarah had doused with gasoline. Mark's hand moved instinctively toward the silent alarm button beneath the counter. "Relax," Miller said, noting the movement. "We're just here to talk." Breslin stayed by the door, his discomfort evident as he scanned the ceiling for security cameras. "I've got nothing to say to you," Mark replied, his finger hovering near the alarm. Miller leaned against the counter, his posture deliberately casual though his eyes remained hard. "Sarah Wilson. Where's she working now?" "I don't know," Mark answered truthfully. "She got transferred. That's all I know." Miller reached into his pocket and placed $200 bills on the counter. "Try again." Mark looked at the money, then back at Miller's face. "Like I said, I don't know. Mr. Wilson handles all transfers personally. Corporate doesn't share that information with us." Miller's expression darkened. He pushed the money closer. "Everyone has a price, and everyone knows something. Maybe you've heard rumors. Maybe she texted you. Maybe you overheard something." "Jim," Breslin called from the door, tension in his voice. "We need to go." Miller didn't turn around. "Not yet." "Yes. Now." Breslin's tone had changed, urgent enough that Miller finally looked over his shoulder. 3 men had entered the store. They wore plain clothes, jeans and jackets, but carried themselves with the unmistakable bearing of law enforcement. The tallest of them nodded to Breslin, then focused on Miller. "Sergeant Miller," he said, not a question, but a statement. "I'm Detective Mercer. This is Detective Daniels and Lieutenant Connor. We'd like a word." Miller straightened, his hand instinctively moving toward his weapon before stopping himself. "What's this about?" Mercer gestured toward the door. "Outside would be better." Mark watched as the 5 men exited, the atmosphere crackling with tension. Through the store windows, he could see them standing in a tight circle in the parking lot, the 3 newcomers positioned in a way that subtly blocked Miller from returning to his vehicle. Inside that circle, Miller felt his control of the situation slipping away. These weren't random detectives. Their timing was too perfect, their knowledge of his whereabouts too precise. "Internal Affairs is taking a special interest in your activities, Sergeant," Daniels said, his voice low enough that only the men in their circle could hear. "Particularly your apparent fixation on Sarah Wilson." "I don't know what you're talking about," Miller replied automatically. "We're working our patrol route." "Your patrol route is 5 miles from here," Connor said, checking his phone as if confirming the information. "And your body cameras are conveniently turned off." Breslin shifted nervously. "This is a misunderstanding." "Is it?" Mercer cut in, focusing on Miller. "Because we have footage of you circling this station 3 nights in a row. We have testimony that you've been asking about Ms. Wilson's whereabouts. We have GPS data from your patrol car showing unauthorized stops at her previous apartment building." Miller's face remained impassive, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. "You've been watching me."